kid from the bush who grew into a legend in his own lunchtime, former SAS soldier Michael J. Malone has seen it all. This is Never Die Wondering, Mick Malone in his own words, hosted by the man himself, Mick Malone, along with Toby Malone, as they examine this long, storied career in the Australian Special Forces. Join us each week for behind-the-scenes insight, exclusive readings, and brutally honest truths from a true original. Welcome to Never Die Wondering. Welcome to episode 40 of Never Die Wondering, Mick Malone in his own words, the podcast that explores the life and legend of Michael John Malone, OAM. My name is Toby Malone, Mick's son and co-host of this podcast series, joined by the man whose name is in the title, Mick Malone. Hi, Dad.
G'day, mate.
How's it going?
Yeah, not bad. Lungs are a bit poor.
That's all right. That's okay. I try to cut out the big eruptions where I can, and I'm sure everyone
Yeah.
forgives the little ones. But 40 episodes. Can you believe it?
Oh, mate. How good's that?
Yeah, right on our way. So we're most of the way through the book. We're sort of coming in on. I mean, we're still got 40 years to go from this point until the end of the book, but we get through it in quick time. And so this next episode, the next chapter, I mean, we're talking about your big trip to England, which you took in 1985. And so when we went over to Canberra for the beginning of 1985, was there much sense that you would be, because much sense you'd be away from the family a lot when we were over there, or was that a surprise that you ended up?
No, we spent a lot of time in the bush, up in Canungra, up in Townsville, Darwin, all sorts of places. So it was much a muchness of what had gone before.
Hmm.
The
Except
job,
before Mum had her mother to help.
yeah,
So that
yeah,
was a bit of a shock, a bit of a different thing when you're
yeah.
away. And then when you went to England, you were gone for a while. How long were you in England in total?
Well, it was supposed to be a 3-month posting.
Right. And then that
Uh,
obviously that was disrupted, as we'll find out. But
yeah,
but 3 months, that's a fair haul
yeah,
when
it's a
you're
long
away.
time. No FaceTime in those days.
No, no. But I think we just put our heads down and kept going and counted the
Yeah.
days to figure it all out. But I mean, if you get that opportunity, you should take it. And
Oh,
so,
look,
yeah. And so that was your first opportunity to leave Australia, not including Vietnam and New Guinea. Uh,
yeah. Well, Malaya. I went to Malaya.
yeah, but you never really got much above the equator. You were always in
No,
Asia. So
never went to America and that sort of stuff.
yeah.
So I was looking forward to England,
Hmm.
um, because it's where it all started, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. And so what was the purpose of the long look, as you call it?
Well, they call it long look, where a member of the Australian Defence Force would be posted to a unit in England, and a member of that unit would be posted to Australia. So
Mm.
an exchange.
But what were you
And,
looking for? Were you looking at what
oh,
they
just
what they're up to?
no, just an experience thing.
Right.
Uh, Being able to pass on a few of the lessons, like on Salisbury Plain. I think I'll talk about it later on. Um, and these idiots are creeping around the bush with frondage in their helmets. And I said to the boss, "What are they doing?" And she said, "Oh, you've got to keep cam." I said, "There's no point if you move to be camouflaged." Oh.
Just looks like the bushes are moving.
So anyway, we were there to pass on a few tips about things, and all of us veterans, as it uh, were sought after, and the Falklands War had only just finished a couple of years before,
Hmm.
so all the instructors in the field wing were all ex Falklands blokes,
Right.
which was interesting. It's a nasty little war, that one.
Right. Well,
Um,
let's just jump into the chapter. It's a longish one, so let's give ourselves enough room to read it and then chat about it after. So let's today we'll be reading chapter 37 of Two Ranks on the Road, 35 Years of Australian Special Forces Service by Michael J. Malone OAM, published in 2024 by Imprimatur Books, Perth. This chapter, entitled England, covers pages 271 to 284 in the print edition. The ebook may have slightly different numbering, so follow from the beginning of the chapter. As we read the body of the text we read by author Mick Malone, whenever we come across a footnote, we'll pause in the least disruptive way possible and I will read the footnotes. And now, without further ado, Two Ranks on the Road.
Chapter 37, England, 1985, The Long Look. Life in the field wing was fairly well full on. Although the cadets still had a full year of classroom instruction, they came to us on a regular basis for exercises, which we spent a lot of time planning. Around the middle of the year, Grub Johnson and I were the last two standing for a long look posting to the School of Infantry in England. Everyone else on the wing had already done a long look, which ruled them out. Grub and I were both keen to go, so we tossed a coin and I won. First thing I'd won in a long time. I was to leave in 2 weeks. I was a bit worried about what Jo would think, but when I told her that night, she was thrilled for me. It involved a 4-month stint at the School of Infantry at Warminster in Wiltshire, located on the edge of the Salisbury Plain, where the military had always had a presence from Tudor times. We flew to London from Mascot and were met by the British Army people and transported to Warminster by bus. The sergeant's mess was fine except for the lack of hot water in the showers. It appears that our hot water pipes went via the officers' mess and they used up all the hot water. Luckily, there were a few Aussies with families in the married quarter patch, and I was invited over to use their shower. I thought, although I didn't use it often, and smelled a bit skanky after a day on the Salisbury Plain. We worked on the plain most days during doing camouflage and concealment and ambushing. Problem with this was the plain was completely treeless except for the odd copse dotted around. Um, the best bits involved infantry tank live firing exercises.
Footnote. The Brit Woe 2 Ray Abbots, who I traded place with on the exchange, was killed the following year on a similar exercise. Death by misadventure, the official decision.
The Poms were a bit laid back and proceeded with all things at a slow pace. These young officer cadets were in a similar situation to our graduating cadets at Duntroon, but ours always showed much more starch and attitude than the Poms. Many of them came from landed gentry class, whose fathers were in Parliament. Arrogance abounded, not like the laconic Aussies at home. Most of the staff were veterans of the Falklands campaign, and in the main, their experience came from there. Some of the older woes saw action on the Jebel in Dhofar and were very useful to have around, but the officers, not so much. There was an Australian officer on the staff named Mark Kelly, who, in the midst of training on the plane, wore army greens and an old army jumper, the same as the one I wore at night in the bush at home. I, however, turned out in full set of cam Gore-Tex I'd acquired from SEAL Team 6 in the 1983 when they came to Swanee to do some training with us. On their way out the door, their chief came into my office with 3 sets of cam Gore-Tex. One for me, we auctioned one and raffled one for squadron funds. I said to Mark, I'll sell you this for 100 quid the day I leave. Yeah, nah, I'm good, he said. Every exercise, he continued to freeze his bollocks off, and I was stepping onto the bus to go to Bryce Norton. He rushed up to me and grabbed the Gore-Tex and thrust 100 quid into my hand. I should have put it up to 200 by this stage. Before this happened, however, there was an unimaginable tragedy unfolding with my family at home. Joe's eldest brother, Ross, had been severely injured in a skiing accident in the snowfields of Mount Buller and was now in an induced coma in a Melbourne hospital. The snow was icy, and his 9-year-old daughter Bronwyn had skied into an area where there were no barriers. As she tumbled down the hill, Ross, who was a very good skier, saw her, skied down below her and caught her. Together they tumbled to the bottom. Ross had hit his head on the rocks and was unconscious. Bronwyn had chamfered the skin off one side of her face and broke her leg, but she survived. I got a call to get to the audit room at Warminster, as my wife would be calling. It was great to hear her voice, but she sounded exhausted and tense. She told me that Ross had had an accident. I told her I would try and get home ASAP. The system was already on the case and had me booked on a Qantas flight from Heathrow the next day. Up at Sparrows and away in an Army Land Rover, it was an uneventful flight to Sydney and then Canberra when all the family waited, along with Kay's mother, Joan Godsall, while Kay remained in Melbourne with Ross. As fate would have it, Joe's mother, Dawn, had travelled to Canberra from Perth on a surprise visit. When the news came about the accident, Joe was able to arrange a midnight dash on the mail plane from Canberra through her cousin, Choco Mears, who was currently flying VIP flights with the RAF. There were lots of tears, but Joe remained stoic and calm because one of them had to remain strong. I was glad I was there to help chopping wood, grocery shopping, looking after our kids, anything else that had to be done. A friend of Ross's, Clem Littleton, arranged for Joe and me to fly to Melbourne to visit Ross in hospital. It was a harrowing time, but these two women were tough. Ross looked calm and deeply asleep, with all the monitors beeping. He had a bruise on the side of his head, and that was the only visible injury. But when they did the ECG, there was no activity. They then moved him into a surgical ward where he died of golden staph infection after 3 weeks in a coma on September the 15th, 1985. The enormity of this tragedy really hit home. He was a serving naval commander at the time with huge career behind him, including service in Vietnam with CET-3, and he was going places till the accident. Admiral rank beckoned. He was a star. His death sent ripples through the naval ranks. If this could happen to Ross Blue, very tragic and sad time for the whole family. It was hard to believe that a man like him and all he'd been through could be snuffed out just like that. R.I.P. Ross Sinclair Blue, always remembered.
Footnote: Ross is memorialised in the Blue Room of the Wardroom in the Royal Australian Naval College, Jervis Bay.
One of my greatest regrets was making the decision to go back to the UK and finish my exchange. In hindsight, my job was to stay with my devastated wife and children. Joe needed me there, but I made the selfish decision to go back. Joe, to her credit, refused to show any disappointment, but I know she must have been hurting. Me abandoning him just like that. I was booked on a RAF 707 to fly back to Hawaii, via Hawaii. Problem was I didn't have an entry visa for the States, and it was pointed out in no uncertain terms that I would not be able to take the RAF flight. That should have been the signal for me to forget about the UK. But no, in my typical pig-headed way, I bought a cheap Malaysian Airlines flight and arrived back at Warminster to be greeted by my section leader with the news that someone else had filled my job. I went to the audit room to find out what was in store for me, and he said, "Looks like you're on holiday, sir." He then proceeded to write me a sheaf of rail passes for every part of England and Scotland. Inverness was as far north as I got before I headed back to London. Warminster had teed up for me to hoochie up with the 3rd Battalion Grenadier Guards in Chelsea Barracks. As I walked into the mess, I met the RSM, an enormously tall man of around 6'8". He stood at the bar of the sergeant's mess being plied with pints of beer. He saw the tie I was wearing at some minor regiment and said, "Get that off in my mess, Major." I took it off and the barman threw me a Guards Division tie, which I wore for the rest of my time there. He was a Yorkshireman with an indeterminate accent, which I had difficulty understanding. After about 20 pints, he collapsed on the floor, but very quickly he was descended upon by all the young sergeants, who hauled him up and carted him off to his bed. There was one other Aussie bloke there with us, and a Kiwi, having our last pint before peeling off. We agreed we wouldn't be seeing the RSM any time soon. I got to bed in one piece and slept the sleep of the dead, only to be woken at first light with this bellowing coming from the playground below our window. Startled by this rude awakening, I opened the window and there was the RSM, resplendent in his uniform, conducting a parade drill for a bunch of soldiers, who I presume were to be defaulters and CBs. The man was ramrod straight with nary a sign that he'd had tied one on last night. This is one tough dude, I thought. Showered and dressed, we headed down to the mess for breakfast. As we were eating, the RSM entered and said to me, "Sergeant Major, I'd like you to accompany me to Windsor Castle for the day. Be ready to go in 1 hour." The other two were not invited, it seemed. I was really ready to go at the allotted time as the Land Rover pulled up outside the mess to pick me up. It wasn't from the Chelsea barracks and wasn't far from Chelsea barracks to Windsor. I was informed that the 3rd Battalion Grenadier Guards was the ceremonial battalion for the month, and mounted guards on the castle was one of their duties. When we got to the castle, the crowds were beginning to form. This was a daily occurrence. Apparently, lots of Japanese, Americans, and people from all over Europe, tourists, just love a parade, and there was a barrier along the edge of the road to keep people back. The RSM and I were able to get through the barrier and position ourselves on the well manicured grass, approximately 75 metres from an archway into the castle. The Grenadier band marched out and took up position on our left. The old guard marched out and took up position facing the archway with a young subaltern out front, and then the new guard appeared from the archway and halted about 15 metres in front of the old guard. The two officers then marched out and halted in front of each other and saluted. The old guard commander handed what I presumed to be the keys to the castle. Just then I noticed the RSM was having an attack of apoplexy. "Are you okay, RSM?" I inquired. "Oh, bloody kill 'em. Did you see that? Did you see that, Sergeant Major? He handed him a fucking sausage." I can only imagine the fate of these two young officers, fresh out of Camberley or wherever, forever in my memory. I made myself scarce at this point and hooked up with another of the 3rd Battalion sergeants, who took me off to inspect the duty officers' quarters. The room was in one of the corner towers, accessed by a narrow staircase. I never knew up to this point how much the Brits loved to carve their names into any wood surface they could find. The room, or cell, was about 15 feet by 15 feet, with navy type bunk against one wall, a small table and a chair. I didn't see any sign of a toilet. The striking aspect of this room was the decorative nature of many of the carvings. The duty officer would carve his family name into a space of 1 foot by 1 foot. Some of the carvings had been done over hundreds of years, and many were generational. Generation after generation had added to his forebears. The most remarkable one I saw was of a lord someone and his preceding generations of lords. It appears the panel had been removed from the wall and sent to Rome to be carved by a master artisan, then returned to the duty officer's cell. Only the Poms would do something like that. We left the castle and walked over the bridge to Eton College, an ancient college catering to the titled families and foreigners with tons of cash. Exclusive boys' school founded in 1440 by Henry VI. and is a sister institution to King's College, Cambridge. The first thing I noticed was the worn down flagstones in the paths, worn away by the feet of thousands of boys over the centuries. I don't think there's ever a plan to replace them, as the school wears their decrepit state as a badge of honour. As we walked around the cloister, we came to a circular basalt plinth set into the wall. It commemorated Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones, VC, who was killed in action in the Falklands War. We then came across the stairs leading up to the Grand Chapel. The wooden stairs had been carved by boys with knives for hundreds of years. Every inch had been attacked. We walked into the chapel to be assaulted by clouds of dust and rotting colours, jutting out on pikes high up in the walls. They had been laid up and left to rot in the English military tradition. Some of the very oldest were mere scraps of rags hanging off the pike. What a tradition. We tend to treat our colours when laid up with reverence and lay them flat, as in the Army Museum of WA.
Footnote, truth is we haven't had colours long enough to rot like those at Eton.
I headed back to Warminster after a few days gingying around London. While in London, the Grenadiers took me up to the Tower of London, built between 1078 and 1399, for a brief tour of the treasure room and the beefeaters' mess. These beefeaters, in their fancy medieval clobber, were all old soldiers in the main, from World War II and Korea. We sank a few pints of Guinness before pulling up stakes. The next day we visited the Royal Chelsea Pensioners Hospital, established in 1692 by King Charles II, to see how the old blokes got on. Their barracks consisted of small cubicles in which they slept and kept their clothes, with 300 residents there at any one time. We ate lunch in their dining room and had quite a conversation with quite a few heavily bemedalled men. The Brits do this sort of service stuff well, and we could learn a bit about it at home. My next task was to skip down to the Staff College at Camberley to visit Colonel Peter Cosgrove, MC, who was instructing there.
Footnote, Cos was a future Chief of Defence Force and later was General Sir Peter Cosgrove, MC, Governor-General of Australia.
I had a bottle of 1RAR port to give him, courtesy of Jazza Smith OAM, RSM Duntroon. When I arrived, he was lecturing young cadets on the vicissitudes of command in action. I found a seat at the back of the packed lecture theatre and witnessed one of the most inspiring lectures I'd ever heard. He spoke with a brilliant, penetrating voice, interspersed with black and white moving battle scenes, played very loudly. Once that part of the film ended, Cos would resume to point out the dramas encountered by young officers and their roles amidst the mayhem. The students sat riveted. When the Q&A segment came, a few brave souls put their hands up, but in the main there was deathly silence. After the lecture, I spoke to him, gave him the port, and stayed for the obligatory cuppa to pass on all the gossip from Duntroon. He was visibly shocked when I told him of the death of my brother-in-law, Ross Blue, as they had known each other quite well. Before we headed back to Australia, I joined Bob Quadling, my old troop commander who was posted to the SAS headquarters in London on an exercise in Denmark. He was 21 SAS, the reserve regiment, and we were to join up with patrols on an exercise named Mr. Mackey, which entailed working against Russian Spetsnaz in the wide open spaces near Viborg.
Footnote, they weren't really Spetsnaz, of course.
Half the squadron parachuted onto frozen corrugated paddocks, and there were quite a few injuries. The cold was spellbinding and I couldn't wait to get out of there. We observed tanks suddenly appearing out of the sides of hills, which was a real eye-opener. Later we drove about 20 miles to a farm to return a Land Rover we'd borrowed, where we were greeted by this beautiful young blonde Lance Corporal in camouflage uniform who led us down into a cellar to introduce us to her team. The team consisted of old 75 and up men in variety of winter clothing and armed with World War II Russian rifles such as the Mosin and the Gant. In Denmark, the entire population, women and all, were armed and ready to mobilise if the Russians looked like they were coming. As she was the only one that spoke English, it was a conversation between her and us. And when she translated different aspects to them, they laughed uproariously. It was a very cosy spot down there with the fire going and the coffee pot on. We stayed for around an hour before it was time to head back. When we got back, the RSM took us down to the compound area where they held POWs. There was about 10 young SAS blokes captured over the last week, kneeling in the snow, blindfolded, with arms tied behind their backs. The thing that made the sight more interesting is that each captive had a large Alsatian dog sitting with them. If they moved, the dog would snarl. This was the first part of the RTI training they would endure. I knew we were at the end of the exercise when the duty-free truck turned up and the CO conducted a general debrief. We then boarded trucks with all our clobber and headed for the airfield where there was a C-130 waiting. The flight back to Bryce Norton was uneventful, filing off in a great conga line. Everyone, but us Aussies, laden down with their duty-free stuff. Quads organised a party at his place in Putney and invited half a dozen expats, including Radar Kemp and others I can't recall. I do remember going to an off licence
Footnote, what they call a liquor store in the UK.
to buy some wine and found a queue down the street of people waiting to buy the recent vintage of French Beaujolais. We picked up a couple of bottles of Wolf Blass and a bottle of French stuff, which was pretty poor in my humble opinion. Back to Chelsea, barracks were recovered from the grog. Once achieved, it was on the road back to Warminster. We met up with the troops for the trip back to Australia. We boarded buses and headed for Bryce Norton, where a Qantas 707 sat waiting. Once we were all on board, we took off and headed for Cyprus, where we would spend a couple of days. I hooked up with Spud Murphy and Zed Fraser once we cleared the Limassol airfield and found a nice little beach bar cafe where we stayed, watching the Cypriots and sundry other Europeans wander past.
Footnote, the Brits knew the women as Swedish swoopers for some unfathomable reason.
The swoopers. Cyprus is a beguiling place with a war still in progress, albeit now a sort of truce between the Turks and the Greeks, who claim half the island each. I have no knowledge of how long this has been going on, but suffice to say it won't end anytime soon. We again boarded our plane for the long haul to Sydney, and once through customs, it was into the old army vehicle, an army vehicle for the run down to Canberra. Lovely to see my family again. Ace was thrilled to see me, as with the rest of the family. The kids hung around with great expectations of what treasures Daddy had brought home for them. And I must admit I had a lot of trinkets and other kids' things. So once again, I was the hero in the house. It was a bit hard to get kids to sleep after such excitement. Toby played rugby in the Darramale under sevens that year and had a lovely time galloping around the paddock with little finesse, while Georgia continued her ballet classes and forged strong friendships with her peers at St Thomas More. One of our favourite things for the three of us, me and the kids and Sans Joe, was to visit the Australian War Memorial of a Sunday. It was our church, as it were. Having visited many of the great military museums in the UK, our AWM was up there with the very best. The kids were always fascinated by the World War I trench dioramas, as was I. They are such a classy inclusion, probably inspired by CEW being after World War I, and have certainly stood the test of time, so are to be treasured. When I first visited the Imperial War Museum in London, in the old Bedlam Hospital in Southwark, I was stunned by the trench scene, where visitors can enter a trench line amid the cacophony of battle sounds. It was so realistic. Unfortunately, when we visited again many years later, the trench had been removed, as had another incredible display, an air raid shelter simulating the Blitz on London. Sitting in there with the loud bombing sounds as the walls and seats shook, it was easy to imagine the horror those resilient Londoners endured. At the AWN, the kids also enjoyed clambering over the tanks out the front of the building in the days when kids were allowed to do so. Nowadays, the wowsers of occupational health and safety have won the battle. Joe's business, Truly Lois, was going from strength to strength, and she and Kay cemented their sisterhood. Jeff and Rhonda Cleary of Pielago Plant Farm were gracious hosts and made their occupation of a lovely gallery shed memorable. Truly Lois continued to flourish with workshops teaching crafting techniques and selling all the makings. While the business was going strong, and it gave Joe a real focus and community in our first stint in Canberra, they would sell the business a few years later, and it is still running today. Back at Duntroon, preparations are underway in the field wing for the major exercise in the Halligander State Forest. We did a navigational exercise based on SAS selection exercise where individual cadets would navigate their way around a series of checkpoints. I managed one checkpoint and had an injured cadet with me by the name of Rick Burr, who went on to be Chief of Army many years later. Rick was one of the sharper ones, and he grilled me on everything SAS for 3 days.
Footnote, yes, he was high on my Reg Beasley likelies list.
Rick was a star who served in an infantry battalion before electing to attend the SAS selection course. After successfully completing the cadre, he then served as a troop commander at SASR, was later a squadron commander and later still commanding officer. The exercise went according to plan, with most cadets knowing their way around the map and compass, although we still had a coterie of cadets who weren't suitable for a combat arm, but they would be posted at a variety of places, including Service Corps, Signals, Transport, Ordnance and Medical.
Footnote, we always had the image of the ordnance hat badge in mind, which consisted of 3 cannons and 3 cannonballs. The balls are far bigger than the calibre of the guns, which was a result of the wrong size ammunition being sent to the front in the battle in the 18th century. The British Army was not pleased, and Ordnance Corps were made to wear this ignominy for eternity, so our Ordnance Corps followed suit.
We spent Christmas 1985 up at Mum and Dad's place in Penrith, where we caught up with Mick Ryan's family, and where our kids were spoiled rotten by grandmothers, aunts and cousins. Afterwards, we headed back to Canberra and picked up Ace from my dog watcher, where he was usually where he was, his usual wiggle waggle self. It was nice to be back in our little house, and we sat down to plan the rest of the holidays, which included many visits to the AWM, the movies down in the Civic, rushing around the college ovals, playing with Ace, and a trip down to Bateman's Bay to stay at a friend's holiday shack on the lake. We spent a fair bit of time kayaking with the kids and swimming. And Jo made the use of her holiday by sleeping and generally relaxing. We ate a lot of fish and chips down there. Before we knew it, graduation was fast approaching, and my list for Reg was now complete. Now it was just a matter of communicating it to him. There was a mad flurry all around the college in preparation for the big day. The cadets sat their final exams and proceeded to bog their gear. Don Raw and Jazza Smith would not tolerate the slightest hiccup. They rehearsed their drill by company under the aforementioned eagle eyes. The colours were paraded and the RMC band was in attendance. On the day, they would perform a mini version of Trooping the Queen's Colour in front of the Commandant and other invited dignitaries. All the cadet families would be there, having flown in from everywhere, including overseas. We were on the we were on the staff. We on the staff were also in attendance with our families, and my mother and father had driven down from Sydney. The parade went without a hitch. Thankfully, prizes and Sword of Honour were presented to great applause. The graduating class then repaired back to the officers' mess with their families, while we WO2s did the same with the sergeant's mess. Dad was very impressed with the pomp and ceremony, pomp and splendour witnessed. He was a lowly baggy ass in World War II and didn't see much of this sort of thing. Mum and Dad stayed at a hotel in the city because our tiny house couldn't accommodate us all. So I caught them for a cup of coffee and said my goodbyes. It was nice to have them down to see my place of work. Big hugs and they're away. We went back to it. We were back into it the next day, helping the cadets pack their bongos and submitting final reports. RMC was quite slick in the mind of cadets, and the waiting for the influx of the new class after Christmas. The new class would be the junior class, with the second class becoming first class.
Footnote, many of the new cadets were ADFA graduates and required only 12 months at RMC to graduate as lieutenants. Those off the street, including serving soldiers, were required to serve 18 months. The rank of second lieutenant was now reserved for the Army Reserve.
End of chapter.
End of chapter, and that was chapter 37 from Two Ranks on the Road, 35 Years of Australian Special Forces Service by Michael J. Malone, OAM, as read by the author. There you go. Okay, England. Plenty of
Made
adventures there.
a great honour to go to England, um, to get it out of my system, basically, because I'd always thought, you know, I'd do well over here.
Right.
Palms were kindly. We all laughed and carried on. I learned a lot from the Falklands blokes. And it was just one of those adventure things where you don't plan it, it just happens. And it was great. It was just perfect.
Yeah, it must have been another one of those incidents. I mean, there's a few of them throughout the course of the book, and there's a few more coming where you must have looked at yourself in the mirror one morning and thought, how did I get here from, from childhood in Binaway
Yeah.
and boarding
Never
school in
figured it out.
Bathurst?
I must admit there was a bit of that going on.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like a good one, and yeah, obviously a fairly traumatic moment for our family that occurred while you're away, and it was obviously a shame that you had to cut things short, and then you went back again. But it's one of those things that so we just a couple months ago, we just passed the 40th anniversary of the death of my uncle, Ross Blue. I'm just holding his picture up to the camera there. If you're watching on YouTube, yeah, it's one of those iconic photos. He was a great man. I don't remember him very well. I was only
Yeah.
7 when he died,
Very impressive.
but
Very impressive.
he was very tall. I remember him being very tall and very striking. He was a very a charismatic man. And
Yeah.
but yeah, we just passed the 40th anniversary of his death in September of 2025, just a few months ago. And yeah, he's one of those figures that still looms large in the family. Um,
Hard to
and
believe it's 40 years.
yeah, and then that was a really, I mean, it was a really traumatic time for us as little kids trying to understand what this was all about. And then closest, our cousins were both of our cousins, Adam and Bronwyn, were a couple of years older than us each. But we were friends with them. We were close friends with them, and so it was very hard for us to understand. It was the first time we'd ever really experienced any kind of death in the family, and because he was so young, um, I'm older now than he was when he died, which is a strange thing to recognize. But
Yeah, terrible thing about it, he was going places. He would have been an admiral
mhm.
in a couple of years.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, could have been him that wound up being the Governor General.
yeah, well, he'd be a likely lad.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and then he left behind his family and Adam and Bronwyn and his wife Kay, who are all still there in Canberra. But yeah, really really tough time. And then obviously, and then you mentioned in the book that my grandmother Noni was over visiting us when it happened, and was there at our house in Canberra when he died. So yeah, so it was a very difficult time. So it's a bittersweet year where you had some great adventures and memories, but then also this horrible trauma that no one really expected. And it's one thing when someone is elderly and gets sick, but it's another thing when someone is so young and dies doing something so stupid as skiing. Um, and
Tragic.
yeah, yeah, that's right. So yeah, I mean, are there other memories that you have from your trip to England that didn't make it into the book? There are other, um, because you got to Scotland, I think, as
I
well.
went by train to Scotland. I went to Inverness, went to a couple of bookshops up there and wandered around, had a few pints, and basically got on the train again and came back.
Well, what's the
Mum and I
story?
went to Mum and I went to the Culloden battlefield
Right.
when we're touring around England years later, uh, and I was quite surprised at the size of the battlefield. It
Mm,
was only a rugby oval,
right.
and there
And
was a
then
choke.
yeah. And then you had the story about how you were standing there in were you in Edinburgh and
Uh,
someone recognized you?
yeah, I'm standing on the parade watching some parade going past, and I'm about six deep in the crowd and eating an ice cream. And a bloke tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Are you Mick Malone?" And I said, "No." It turns out he was one of my sergeants from 2 Commando Company.
Right. So that was when you were there later, when you were there in 98.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's a small world sometimes, isn't it? So, yeah, it's a great adventure that you got to go up there and you got to watch some rugby um and yeah, basically see. So, did you come away with a favorable impression of the English system, or did you think, oh no,
Yeah, it's quite impressive, the old Poms. I must admit, they've got a lot of history behind them, and a lot of them try to live up to um, what went before, especially World War One. They're
hmm
still very dismayed about the amount of men they lost in World War One, even though I pointed out to them that we lost more per capita than they did in World War One.
right,
Our 60,000 killed was the most of anyone on the battlefield
right,
per capita. We only had 2.5 million people here
yeah,
at that stage. Absolutely dreadful.
yeah, yeah. It's I mean, obviously, it's not great to compare such statistics, but yeah, it's terrible all over the place. So, well, that's great. Really interesting chapter. Lots of good things about it, and it's all the time we have this week. So, join us next week for the next installment in our exploration of Mick Malone's career as we get into the 38th chapter of the book itself, entitled "OCS Descends on Duntroon." If you have a copy of Two Ranks, read along with us. I've been Toby Malone, and thank you to Mick Malone for continentally joining me on this journey.
My pleasure, mate.
This has been Never Die Wondering, Mick Malone in his own words. For links to purchase your own copies of Mick's books, visit the show notes or mickmalone.com.au. This podcast is produced by Toby Malone, Joe Malone and Mick Malone, and engineered by Toby Malone. Theme music is The Happy Wanderer, the official SAS march, as reimagined by Cormac Malone and Meg Logue Malone. Yes, this is a family affair. This is a GM production in association with Imprimatur Books.